if you open a newspaper, if you turn on the television, you can see cases involving fingerprint evidence. You see burglars. You see rapists. You see murderers that are basically brought to justice, that are linked to the scene of a crime based on fingerprint evidence. So I need to stress, we know this works. And I could probably go to each person in this room, and you could probably tell me at least a dozen cases that you've personally been involved in, that you've personally worked to show that this works, because we do it. We've seen the results of it, okay? But there are critics out there, and there's always going to be people out there that are saying, yeah, but look at this. And we've got to be able to address that. You know, we've got people saying that that our science, our system is riddled with flaws, that we can't claim that zero error rate, and that because of these weaknesses, we're going to create a miscarriage of justice. Now, if you look at the National Academy of Science report that was issued in 2009, it basically gave some recommendations and findings based on the forensic disciplines and some of their weak areas. Now, I need to stress, and this is going to be stressed all day, okay? We were not the only ones hit. So don't single yourselves out. Don't think, well, there's something wrong with our practice. We're not saying that. And this can be taken, this report, and everybody's probably blue in the face about talking about it because that's all we really hear about now. But this report can be taken as a critique, a way of allowing us to improve and to grow within our practice, or we can take it as a knock at the knees, cut down at the knees, and just take and be on the defense about it. And we don't have to be, because this is giving us an opportunity to look at other ways of approaching our practice, okay? Not to take away from it, not to invalidate it, but to allow us to grow and allow us to strengthen the current practice that we have, okay? That's what we can that's how we need to look at this. But the NES report really dinged us on saying that not all evidence is equally good, because a lot of that evidence is based on the quality of the latent print. Well, duh. We know this. Do we not know this? So they're not telling us anything we don't know. And that some of our methods, some of our practices are not consistently showing or demonstrating how a latent and a known originated from the same source. And I think what they're talking about, and we're going to get into this later on, is the transparency. We're not showing them how we're getting those results. Now, what do you think? Do you think there's any substance to these challenges? Do you think there's a reason for concern to be raised? So I see some head shaking. Absolutely. Okay. Because I think you really have to look at who you're considering to be part of that forensics community. And if you're looking at it strictly from a latent print practitioner's view, just us, the ones that are doing it, the law enforcement that are working the cases day in and day out, you kind of want to throw that card of, what do they know? They're not doing it. I'm doing this. I know what I'm doing. But if you look at it as an all-encompassing way, and if you're looking at it from not only a scientific perspective, but a legal perspective, you can kind of see some of the concern, because you've got lawyers, you've got judges and juries, even those in academia that are questioning that. And if we're looking at it from both sides, there's substance to what they're asking. So what we're going to do, let me make sure I'm on the right slide. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this criteria and we're going to go through it, and it's going to be the scientific validity and sufficiency and consistency, transparency, reproducibility, and training. It's a lot, and we're going to go through this criteria, and I need you to understand what we're talking about. So when we're talking about scientific validity, we're talking about the basic premise of our science, and regardless of how long you've been in this field, there's two principles, the principles of what our science is founded on have been beat into your head. What are they? Permanence and uniqueness. barring injury, death, or disease, our fingerprints are permanent and they're unique to each individual. Okay? That's not being disputed. Nobody's disputing biological uniqueness. Nobody's saying that it's not unique. Where the questioning starts coming into play is when you have a partial, which is normally what we deal with at a crime scene, how much still needs to be there and maintain that uniqueness. So it goes into a question of sufficiency. What's usable? And there's some current research. Paul and I are involved in current research and sufficiency. It's really looking in that area of what's enough, what are people deeming a value and not a value, and why are they, some of the factors involved in why you're throwing it away, so to speak. And then with that being, possibly having definitions, but not necessarily them being really specific, just in general definitions of what sufficiency constitutes, you have a question of how do you bring consistency into that, okay? How are you ensuring that each examiner achieves the same result? Consistency across the board, not necessarily just consistency within your agency. And then when you ask those questions, you have to look at transparency. How are we assigning that weight to those features? How are we showing how we're getting our results? And that's one of the areas I think that when they're talking about in the NAS report, when they're asking questions about our methodology and saying that some of it doesn't demonstrate a consistent way of how we say a latent and a known originated from the same source, I think they're really looking at the transparency. How are we showing how we're reaching those conclusions? And how are we reproducing those results? How can we reach the same results each and every time? And then another question, and this is going to be the question of the day, how do you train a competency? What do you do? And we're not necessarily going to be talking about error rate today because error rate doesn't necessarily come into play with the tools that we're going to be using. But it's how many times do you expect your process to fail? So once again, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions in this PowerPoint. Is it fair? Do you think the criteria set is fair? I see some nods. It's fair. Because once again, if you're looking at the forensics community as a whole, from a legalistic and scientific perspective, it's fair. You understand why people are asking the questions. Because I think as practitioners, as people that are doing this day in and day out, that have been trained to do this, it's very easy for us to say, I don't get why you don't get this. I know what I'm doing. I'm doing it. It's right. What's the big deal, you know? But from a legal standpoint, they need that robust information. They need something to show them how we're getting those results and how, you know, that transparency, they need that. And I think from a moral, ethical obligation, they deserve it, and we deserve to be able to give that to them. So basically a set of tests that's been pretty much to look at the scientific method and a way of remembering Daubert criteria as a gatekeeper. That's just an acronym one of the latent print examiners within our field has created to help us remember some of those guidelines. And it really goes beyond that general acceptance rule. So it's not just about the results, but the methodology, making sure that it's sound. So when we're talking about general acceptance, we're really talking about all-encompassing, the whole entire forensics community accepting our practices, our methodologies. And we're talking about testing and peer review. We're talking basically about what we can agree upon, the thresholds that we set. So it's what can be tested and what can be agreed upon. And you're going to be looking at areas of scientific validity, reproducibility, and sufficiency. And if you look at Daubert, it helps understand what we mean by scientific validity. It's talking about the evidence not only being relevant, but it's reliable. And it's really, like I said, it's taking that reliability not from the results but the methodology itself. So you've got to really ask yourself, what constitutes as reliable then? And it's going to be the scientific validity and the consistency and the reproducibility. So it really takes the focus off just the examiner. It's not all about us. And we've also got to remember, this isn't an attack on us. It's just looking at our methods. And I think the NAS report really summed it up quite well, in my opinion, when they basically said that analytical divisions or disciplines have a notable degree over disciplines that are based on expert interpretation. It's just solidifying the fact of, it's not us. It's not all about what we say, and because we're the expert, this is the way it is. They need more. So when we're talking about known standards, it's basically the thresholds that you set, and that's going to be in areas of training, because you train to competence based on those thresholds. Would you agree? And once again, rate of error, though we're not really going to be discussing that today. So this is where we are. What I've attempted to do is provide some references, both from a legal and scientific perspective, that are logical and relevant to the situation at hand, and try to give some criteria that we can set to look at some of the reasons for the fingerprint comparison work. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take both approaches that are used, the non-numeric and numeric approaches, and we're going to address and kind of relate it back to that criteria to see how it fits. Now, we have a non-numeric standard in the US, but for all fairness, we're going to also be looking at the numeric approach as well. So when we're talking about minutia and features today, we're talking about the ridge endings and bifurcations. We're not talking about the dots, because the tool that we're using isn't going to actually focus on dots. It's just strictly the bifurcations and ridge endings. And when we're talking about features, we're talking about the totality, everything. We don't have a set threshold based on the II 1973 resolution stating there was no scientific basis for a predetermined amount or number of friction ridge characteristics in two impressions. It was later confirmed. Some of the terminology, some of the wording was changed to 95 in Neuron, just to go from no scientific basis to no valid basis. But and the methodology that we use is ACE-V methodology. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, take a stab at it. What is the analysis phase doing? What are you doing in the analysis phase of ACE-V?
Determining if you have a workable...
Exactly. If it's sufficient enough to go on to the next stage of comparison, which you're basically... Exactly. And you're making a comparison. You're comparing that latent to that known. Evaluation phase is you concluding, or your results, saying it's ID, non-ID, or inconclusive based on how your agency reports out. And then the verification. You have an independent examiner coming in behind you, ensuring that the process and the results are correct. Is it pretty much in a nutshell? So basically what we're doing is we're not only looking at the minutia, the bifurcation, and the ridge endings, which are level 2, but we're also taking a step further, and we're looking sometimes at, and I'm writing on this, give me a second. Okay. There you go. Sorry, excuse me. Knew something was going to happen with this pen. So let's look at how the non-numeric approach works. You have, even though you don't have a standard threshold or a point system, so to speak, we do have thresholds, and they're really connected, woven together, regardless of how we look at it. We've got personal thresholds and we've got institutional thresholds. Your personal thresholds are really going to be based on your experience, the level of comfort, or probably comfort's not the best word, but the level of where you feel that you're comfortable making an ID. And that's going to vary somewhat, and that's going to be a lot of based on your training, which goes into the institutional thresholds. You're looking at in-service training and in-house training, and that's really going to be a management issue. I always give the example of the way I was trained may be completely different from the way you were trained. So where I might be comfortable making an ID on 5 or 6 points, somebody else might think I'm crazy. It's all based on how you're trained. And institutional thresholds, they bring a consistency, but that consistency really stops at the door. It's expected almost to a point when you work with somebody day in and day out and you train with that person day in and day out, you're expected to come to that same conclusion and have that same personal threshold, right? And it's very easy because of that to get that mentality because you're not having those inconsistencies. And pretty much everything's flowing right in between the examiners within your own agency. It's very easy to get that, what are they doing wrong? We're not having those problems. They're just not any good. I've probably been guilty of even saying it. And when you work case audits, if you ever work personal, on the personal forensic side of it or the private sector, it's very easy to get in that mentality, that black box mentality of it's just we're fingerprint prodigies. And people get a laugh out of this, but I always ask them, did you wake up one morning and just say, hey, I think I'm going to be a latent print examiner today? No, because a lot of people that get in this field, they'll tell you, I had no intentions of doing this. So my question to you is it an ability that you can be trained to have based on training and experience, or is it something you're just born with? We know there's limitations. We know there's visual limitations to what some people can do, but what do you think?
There's a little bit of both. Yeah.
A little bit of both.
A little bit more ability than others.
Exactly. Every level, the levels are going to be different. Very good. So when you really look at the non-numeric approach, there might be some areas that are not as well-defined. They're not as clear as we think because there's some areas that we can't really apportion weight to. There's some features. There's some issues of transparency within what we're doing. So when you look, at that criteria and you base it on what we know as far as the non-numerical approach goes, you've got to look at the scientific validity and sufficiency and consistency again. And when you look at the scientific validity, it's there, don't get me wrong. You have people like Group or Kenji Malpighi that made observations about fingerprints, but they were anatomical observations. They weren't necessarily really going towards uniqueness or personal identification. And then you've got people like Herschel and Falls and Galton that made reference to personal identification. They used it for criminal identification a lot of means, but yeah, they published. But in a modern day sense, though it's there, and I need to stress that, it's there. But in a modern day sense, some of that empirical evidence, some of that experimentation may not be up to par, so to speak. And when you look at probability studies, there has been research in past few years that can that's been tested and peer reviewed, that's been shown the reliability of fingerprints. So we're looking at some of how it's been reported. Like I said, it's there. It just may be lacking in certain areas. With sufficiency, once again, it doesn't necessarily offer any definition. SWCFAST takes a jab at it, but it's very broad. It basically says adequate quality and quantity and 2 friction ridge impressions. they define it, but it's not sound. It's still very vague. And then with consistency, when you don't have any means of saying what's usable, it's hard to be consistent, even when you have a methodology set in place. And then with transparency, I got to ask you, what part of ACE-V gives that transparency? What part of ACE-V shows how we assign that weight? So how are we showing that we're getting those results? And these are just questions for you to ponder. And because I know when I first got started, really on that research committee, I had a hard time with that. I had a very hard time saying that, well, maybe ACE-V could be improved. Maybe we could use some support tools. That was hard for me to say because my training, that was gold standard. And we're not saying that there's anything wrong with it, but with it, how are we reproducing and how are we training? It's a great set of guidelines, great set of rules on how to do a comparison. So we're not by any means trying to say that it's invalid, that we shouldn't use it, that we should throw it out. We're just simply saying, to ensure that it continues, why don't we start looking at other tools, other support tools, to further support the current approaches that we have. That's what we're saying. With the numerical approach, you have a strict threshold of features. Based on what country you're from, where you are, you have a threshold of normally 8 to 16, okay? You can reference it back to early pioneers such as Edmund Lacard and Alphonse Bertillon. And they use ACE-V, it's just not necessarily called ACE-V. So when they're doing their comparisons, they're really looking at level 2. They're looking at the bifurcations and the ridge endings. You got to ask yourself, are the thresholds valid? Now, we just said a few minutes ago, or I just said a few minutes ago, that based on the 73 resolution and the confirmation in 95 through NORM, that there was no scientific basis for a predetermined amount of friction ridge characteristics. So it makes me wonder, how can this threshold be valid when one of the largest forensic organizations is saying that there's no valid basis for it? So the question is it bringing an illusion of certainty? Is it just kind of like a comfort blanket for some? So you match or exceed, you got an ID. You know, it sets that standard, it sets a point, something for you to reach to, and if you reach it, you can walk away going, you know, I did everything I could do. So when you're looking at scientific validity, again, you can reference it back. And what I found very interesting when I was doing the research for the Standardizations 2 Committee, when I started asking people, or different people from agencies around the world, you know, well, why do you have the threshold that you have? Nobody could tell me. Nobody knows. It's just kind of like, well, that's what they told me. They said it was 12. I go with 12. It's kind of like, you know, are we monkeys? Or are we latent print examiners? You know, and we know that it's not simple because they can be modified based on the circumstances. So it might bring a definition of what we can use, but unless it's consistent, it's not sound. And if that changes, it's not going to be consistent. And it's really just going to be an illusion of that certainty. It's going to be an illusion of that transparency. And if the definitions aren't applied, reproducibility it's not going to be sound, okay? And the question of the day, how do you train to competence? If you look at both of them, like I just said, the numeric standard can be modified. So it's not as simple as we would like to say it is. And if you really look at both standards, the non-numeric and numeric standards, neither one of them are really well defined, if you really look at it. So how can the process be improved? Well, we're here. So apparently we have an idea. There is a possibility of using probability tools, not to replace anything. I'm going to stress that. Paul is going to stress that. We are not suggesting replacing our current methods. We're just simply saying, is this a little added muscle? It's another support tool for this. So we're not invalidating either process. We're not saying that they're not working. We're just simply saying, let's give them what they need for them to understand what we already know is working so that we ensure that our processes continue, okay? So what we're gonna do today in just a few moments, if you've got, and after we do like a little question and answer, if you've got any questions for me or Paul, Paul's gonna get up here and we're going to do, he's gonna do a PowerPoint with you and kind of go over the probability tools and some of the benefits of it, okay? Any questions? Y'all been great. Nice smiling. I appreciate it. Okay. Well, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul, I guess. You know what? And out of my nervousness, I forgot. I would like to go around the room and have you guys introduce yourselves and kind of give us a background, what you do, some of your experience levels. Starting with Mr. Greg.
I'm Greg Eilers, supervisor of Leighton Print section at Lakewood PD in Colorado, and Leighton examiner for over 26 years, and had some exposure with the probability software before, but
Welcome.
Brian Delmas, currently with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Western Lab in Asheville, North Carolina. Supervisor of the Leighton section there, and have about 36 years total experience with the Lake Print.
I'm Tanya D'Angelo. I'm here locally with Pinellas County Sheriff's Office as a Leighton examiner. I've been in Fingerprints for more than 8 years, a Leighton examiner for about 3. And I'm very limited knowledge so far in probability. So.
My name is Heather Connor. I'm a forensic Leighton Print examiner with the Mesa Police Department in Arizona. I've been there since June of 2005 in the Leighton section, and I've taken some workshops and some other things with probabilities.
My name is Dustin Calvin. I'm a Leighton examiner with the Johnson County Sheriff's Office in Kansas. I've been doing this for about 9 years, and I have very little experience with probability.
That's fine.
I'm Julie Avila. I'm a forensic scientist at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Milwaukee. I've been a fingerprint examiner for 8 years, almost 9 years at the State Public Defender's Office, teaching them about forensics. So I also have limited knowledge.
Owen McDonald, Caddo Sheriff's Office, Shreveport, Louisiana. I'm a lieutenant over crime scene investigation and fingerprint section. So, been doing fingerprint work for about 24, 25 years. Understand probably enough about probability to be dangerous, to get hurt.
Welcome.
Noreen Moore, I'm the supervisor for the County Sheriff's Office, Leighton Lab. I've been Leighton examiner for about 17 years. And I know very, very little about probabilities. There's a lot of talk being thrown around, and our office is doing a lot of checking into a lot of it. A lot of our examiners have gotten some training on it.
I'm Jason Knights from the Boca Raton Police Department down in Palm Beach County. I'm actually a crime scene technician, but I've been doing Leighton prints for about, studying it for like 4 years and actually doing casework for about 2 years. We have one primary like senior Leighton print examiner, and like when he goes out of town or on a trip or on vacation, you know, I'm the one that pretty much runs the lab when he's out of town. And I'm hoping to slide into his position when he retires in a couple of years.
I know that feeling.
I'm Lisa Daniel, and I'm with Illinois State Police. I work in the laboratory down at Carbondale in Southern Illinois.
I have about 15 years of experience in latent prints, and we are currently dealing with a bunch of these issues with transparency, trying to become more transparent, and this fits right in because we know nothing about probability.
I'm Deb Parkin. I'm with Cottonwood Heights Police Department. I have about 15 years experience, not all doing latent print, mostly crime scene. Now I do more latent print examination. I'm also working with our state laboratory and know very little about probability.
I'm Mitch Rector. I'm with the Birmingham, Alabama Police Department. I've been in forensics for about coming up on 23, 24 years. 10 years as a latent examiner, and currently I'm a tool-mark examiner, firearms, and the training coordinator for our forensics division in Birmingham. Familiar with most of the critics. I'm a pack rat for these, for the critics. I've got a lot of their information, and Simon Cole, who you mentioned, is probably, he's the leader here.
Yeah, most verbal, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mitch Wisniewski, Lake County Crime Lab, fingerprint and firearms examiner. I've got 17 years with Lake County and 24 years with Cleveland PD, retired Cleveland PD examiner. So got a lot of experience with latents, but not too much with probability.
Yes, my name is Linda Wilson. I'm with the Nashville Police Department, Nashville, Tennessee Police Department. I've been a latent examiner for about 15 years. Very limited knowledge of probability, but like him, a lot of latent print experience.
My name is Melissa Skipper. I'm with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. I've been doing crime scene for almost 9 years, and I've been doing fingerprints, footwear, tire tread, bloodstain pattern analysis, and crime scene with the state for 5.
So you see the variation of knowledge in this subject matter, as well as experience levels ranging from 30 down to 2 or 3. And the reason we wanted you to say what level of experience you're at is to show you that it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have up until this point on probability. And it doesn't matter how many years that you've got in under your belt. This is something that everybody can use. And as we work with the tools today and tomorrow, you're going to be able to see that. So we welcome you. We're excited about the class, and we think it's going to be a good class. And we're here if you got any questions.